All right, I'm gonna get started. Welcome anyone who is watching. Thank you for joining the stream. This is going to be the. Hi, Sandra. How are you? I'm so glad you're here. Uh, so yeah, this is gonna be the last stream that the last of 3 streams that I do for Ghosts and Flowers for with Fulcrum Arts. And it's been really great, so thank you to them. And I just want to say before I get started that please stick around, because after I demo the game in its still very pre-alpha state, I'm going to have a conversation with Alejandro Segade, who I am so excited is joining me for this to have a conversation about this game, and we're going to talk about lots of hopefully interesting things. So welcome, friends, across the expanse of the Earth. And yeah, it is exciting. I'm excited. So yeah, I'm going to get started. So before I start, I'm going to do this. Anybody who's been here for some of the other streams, this is going to go a little bit differently in that I'm going to pick there's a decision that you make within the sort of visual novel component of the game that I'm going to take. I had been choosing one way, which lets you play as this sort of child character that has, difficulty, it's using what's referred to as ragdoll physics, which, and it falls down a lot and it sort of bumbles through the world. So I'm going to pick the other path, which is, well, you'll see. But then that path isn't so built out yet. And the dialogue is still very much a work in progress, but I really want to go through that. And then after we see that, I'm going to go open up the sort of child view, and we'll see a little bit of, we'll go through that as well for anybody who, wasn't there for previous streams. All right, I'm going to stop bumbling and mumbling or rambling or whatever the word you want to use for it, and I'm going to get started. So cool. So this brings us to Ghosts and Flowers, our title menu. You have 2 options: enter to leave. It's not hooked up yet, but leave is going to. I'm really interested in the idea of attempting to leave and entering another sort of liminal space in which, obviously you could always hit Alt F4 to close the program and eventually you'll be able to get out, but I'm interested in the complications of leave. I don't know, leaving has been something that probably has been on a lot of our minds the past, 9 months. So I'm going to click enter. Which brings us to a little short video that right now at least is really, it's not, you can't click through it, you can't hit escape to come out of it. And I've been thinking a lot about, I think I mentioned this in the last stream, but I've always been a really big fan of the online publication Triple Canopy. And, part of their, ethos, I think it's their slogan or whatever, is, to slow down the internet. And I'm sort of interested in, slowing down, how you interact with the game. All right, so that's going to bring us to our first, the visual novel section of the game. This is, if you're not familiar with the genre, it's one that I've been really interested in for a long time. The history of it comes from Japan, and it was the sort of taking, Japanese role-playing games and removing a lot of the gameplay for it and reducing it down to the story mechanics. And so visual novel, I always thought, is a really terrible descriptor because it's not really a visual novel. It's not a graphic novel either. But that's what the genre is called. I'm not sure what, interactive novel, that sounds, I don't know, non-sequential novel, to use a line from Hamlet on the holodeck. But anyway, so I'm going to click to progress. But I just wanted to say, I think that visual novels are a really great vehicle for embodiment and the embodiment of ideas, but also the embodiment of other perspectives and such. They've really been embraced by disabled community, the trans community, queer communities. There's a really great one called, Butterfly Soup, if you haven't played, that I find really, I don't know, sweet and nice, but also well done and well illustrated and everything. Anyway, I'm going to click to progress. PC. And this is using what's referred to as elite speak. It's, sort of like a abstraction or a manipulation of elite. And it really comes from like late 90s, early 2000s, quote unquote, hacker culture. And as sort of ways to obfuscate language. And this is the simplest sort of generation one of it, where it's just replacing letters for numbers that are, similar in shape. But as it sort of progressed, sort of like as different ways to create opacity, it it changed and evolved. But this is sort of Gen 1. So PC, it's your turn. Lungs, it was just our turn. Well, it's your turn again. And eventually this will be voice acted, primarily for accessibility reasons. It's just, I'm not going to put that in until I'm sort of have the dialogue, which is still very much a work in progress, sort of solidified. Plant, your impertinence invites our severest displeasure. This was a line from the Neil Gaiman Sandman comic book that, when I was like 14, read it. I thought it was really like the cleverest, funniest thing. So I don't know clever, but I really, it's stuck in my brain. And the lungs character is, so all of these characters are sort of attempting to embody, sort of, not so directly allegorical or metaphorical, but work to represent different parts of my personality. I'll stop, I'll go through it a little quicker as sort of I talk a little bit more introducing it. But so I suffer from, a confluence of autoimmune or disease, or a confluence of symptoms that, come down to an autoimmune disease, in which that is attacking primarily my digestive tract, nervous system, and lungs. And the lungs are the most contentious, most difficult part of my body. So they really become this very cruel character within it. So thinking about the sort of embodiment of cruelty and antagonisms, I couldn't think of anything more so than lungs, or my lungs. Not our problem, noob. Ghosts and Flowers has been... Well, it did come up again, so this will be interesting. I'm going to sort of... Boredom, heartache. And it's the same clip, too, which is sort of long, which is sort of annoying. But hey, that's okay. Pretty much the beginning of quarantine as a way to... It's weird to hear a double of my voice, right? Frustration, I decided to take on constructing a visual novel type of game I've always really liked. They're really, I don't know, I feel like they're a really productive place for embodiment, to deal with representation, and to take on perspectives and thoughts that might, not be entirely your own. Okay, so yeah, I'm taking this dialogue and then randomly at different parts as you click, and so it like gives us, you can keep reading and clicking through while listening, or you have the potential of, stopping and listening. So I don't know, just thought it was sort of an interesting meta sort of insertion into the game, sort of breaking that wall. Because I think of labor all the time. I don't think people realize the exorbitant amount of labor that often goes into the video games that they play. And this being a video game that I've pretty much created entirely on my own. The only component right now that is someone else is my wonderful friend John Campolo, who I often collaborate with, has made this sort of backing musical track. And this is provisional, and he's going to be, sort of building that out. So lungs. Someone there? Nothing to do. There's never anything for us to do. Why is there nothing fun for us? Hello? Where did our friends go? They must be up and about by now. Are you there? Cough, cough. Oh, there you are. Of course we are here. What is it this time? Well, the thing is, you really are infuriating. Out with it or leave us alone. We're bored. Play with us. Insufferable simp. Must we always take care of you? You always let us down. We need your help the most. You ask too much. Go play by yourself. So at this point, and I haven't done any work to this since any of the last streams, but at this point you can just decide to explore or stay. If you click explore, it's going to bring you up to this sort of like main, you know, almost like proscenium view, and you will be able to move the cursor around and you can see toilet, PC, bust, dead books. And right, there'll be small little puzzles inserted into each of these and some sort of flavor text that will allow you to, you know, learn more about the world. I've always been a big fan of one of the, like, I really, you know, I've always really appreciated the way that, you know, a game like Hollow Knight tells the narrative through, you know, different little bits of lore that you can read here and there. Love Hollow Knight, one of my favorite games. So, you know, if you click on toilet, right now all you can do is open and close the toilet. You know, open toilet, close. There'll probably be a flush where it'll actually like just, you know, shake the water around, close. Click back. You can go to the books. There'll be an open and close, and there'll be some sort of text, you know, that you can read in the books. You know, this is sort of like a reference. There's a number of references to my very problematic obsession with H.P. Lovecraft, and, you know, someone that, you know, I read a lot when I was younger, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I started to understand the, you know, the underlying racism and you know, sort of his own sort of pathology and connection with all of that. And I'll click back. PC. Again, there'll be a bunch of, I still haven't changed this out, but there'll be buttons that sort of better emulate, you know, probably some sort of mixture between this and this. And you'll be able to like see different screens depending on a series of buttons. But again, none of that's really working yet. So I'm going to click Finish Exploring. That brings you to board. We're still bored. Where were you the day the world went away? Here, where else would we be? Could we be? The Lungs character was originally an octopus, and I sort of was really thinking about specificity and like thinking, you know, I already said that it was like this contentious body part, but then you know, there's still parts where it still looks like an octopus at times, but you know, just sort of still playing around with that. But you know, octopi, if you don't know, really don't like each other and don't like a proximity to others. And if you put two octopi into a small tank, one of them will eat the other. Here, where else would we be? Could we be? We don't remember. Where were we? Certainly not our place to know such information. Perhaps you're out playing in the world. Perhaps dancing? You, never dancing. Why can't we dance? You would simply fall and need our help. Again. We have heard that it's come back. And so dancing is something, as like I've developed more nerve pain, you know, that's really ramped up the last year and a half. Something that I've, you know, well, I mean, obviously no one's really dancing, at least within groups right now anyway, but it's something that, you know, my body isn't really capable of anymore. It's something that I do definitely miss dearly. We have heard that it's, even though I'm a terrible dancer, you know, the worst, you know, yeah, just the worst. We have heard that it's come back. Our dancing? Dancing, no insufferable idiot, the world. I was actually with my friend Sam Moyer once at a like this Brooklyn dance club. thing. And while like we were leaving and she was grabbing our coats, and while this was a long time ago, and while she was dancing, this guy came up to me and asked if I actually thought I knew how to dance. And I was like, no. And he said, yeah, because you're terrible. Anyway, dancing, no, insufferable idiot, the world. The world. Yes, the world. We have heard that it's back. Can we go see it? You want to go to the world? Do you want to die? Do you want to end us all? And you can decide if you like want to go to the world or live. If you go to the world, that's going to take you to the routes I had shown in previous streams where you play as the child character and you really, sort of you're bumbling through the world and you're falling and struggling to get up all the time. If you pick live, you're going to play as one of a couple different characters. Only one of them is sort of in there right now. Also with the child, depending on a choice that you make later on, it's going to decide how antagonistic that world will be for you. But I'm going to pick live. Fine, stay. You know we hate to be close together, so please leave us be. We need you. Play with us. We're in this together now. We hardly see it that way, but at least you're being sensible. We hate proximity. Why can you not leave us be? We really do miss the world. You really believe the world was made for you by people that look like you, don't you? So this is less of a, this line is less of a ha-ha moment at other people and really sort of trying to like, I don't know, point that finger at, that child is my own sort of naivete slash innocence, I don't know. And, sort of pointing the finger at, as, a white cis man, my own sort of, the white supremacy within myself and the problematics of myself. And so anyway, we don't understand. If not for us, then who is the world for? So this is something I've been adding more and more in, where, as characters are talking, you'll see more illustrative things as well, and sort of breaking that you're only in this sort of contained box, helping you sort of like begin like embody ideas and such. You have had your whole history swept up by the memory surgeons. All the while, we are forced to remember every indignity and crumble with nausea every time we are forced to look back at that history. We are swelling with the unthought thoughts, hurling them into the world like dead skin. And what of the world that you miss so dearly? In the world, you did all of the important things, leaving the old and the sick to do the real work. While you were far away with your ludic delights. This was a time of sadly predictable oppression, cosmic madness, meat tablets, videophonic telephones, and eldritch technicians. What do we not remember? Can you please stop doing that with your mouth? What, our mouth? Can you keep it still? You keep contorting it all the time. It's grotesque. So that's actually a line I stole from Sartre's No Exit. I, have obviously, but while thinking this, I've been thinking so much about like purgatorial space, and as the purgatorial space or the liminal space sort of becomes the static space. And that's a particular line that I've always found really funny and interesting. Because, obviously there's nothing we can do about our mouths. What were you saying about the world? About our memory? It really is unnerving. Our memory? Your mouth. Ugh. But the world. Simply put, in terms even you may understand, that you believe it was made for you. You can decide for us or no. And so that also, which isn't actually implemented yet, will sort of structure the world and like how alien and isolated it is for the character that, enters in. So I'm going to click for us because that's the one that I have a little bit more well built out. We knew it. Selfish, impertinent child. Not a child. Then what do you think you are? Perhaps a fish? Nonsense. Our mother was a fish. So that's actually a line from, which I had mentioned earlier, Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. It's my favorite chapter ever in a book, which is just Vardman saying, my mother is a fish after, his mom died. And then he goes to the neighbor's house and sees the neighbor frying a fish and sort of like conflates these two dead bodies. Well, suffice to say, that doesn't make you a fish. We don't see why not. We feel like a fish. If you are a fish, then where's your bowl? We're in it. How self-absorbed can you be? Do we only exist for your amusement? Feels like a bowl. We're stuck here. If this is your bowl, then who is cleaning it? We don't mind cleaning. We are not impressed. The world was made for you, then it's your mess to clean up. That's not fair. Not fair as having to listen to your plights and gripes, as bad as. Not fair. Sisyphus. What? Who? To be bored means that one has no inner resources. Plant, how dare you? We are not a pretentious blowhard. Now, child, clean your mess. Fine. We are not cruel. What's happening? Plan is condemning us, as if they are any more helpful or more altruistic. Lungs, save your breath and just chill. Just be chill. I thought lungs and save your breath was cute. Humph. Plant, you're not any better. Cool down. Leave us be. Have some sick. So this is sort of a holdover from when it was an octopus and it was ink, so I just need to illustrate some whatever this new thing will be as it sort of moves and disappears. Ugh. Gross. Man, they really gotta chill out. We're sorry we yelled at you. Well, you're not always the easiest to deal with. Between you and child, we have a lot to take care of. You're not a burden. It's just, well, you need a lot of care. And sometimes you can be a little. Still very much working on this dialogue. Well, fine. Be that way. We don't care. We hope it's supposed to be, we hope your leaves turn black out there. No, wait. We didn't mean that. Wait. Let me click on world. So there will be an interstitial video here that isn't happening yet. Loading the world. So that brings us to a 3D space where we're now playing as the plant. I had initially started off in the elevator of this building, but I thought it was more interesting to sort of start it off. And this is the sort of empty space, and you can control the plant, and you can sort of rotate the camera around. And the plant, unlike the child, is actually pretty easy to control, if you're familiar with standard third person, controls. And it can also jump. So if it jumps, and then it sort of flows down. And I worked very hard to get the leaf physics, looking pretty good. So as the, it moves around, the leaf, sort of plant. And I was thinking a lot about with the plant, this idea of care and often the reliance of, the disabled on the temporary able, specifically thinking a lot about my mother who suffered from multiple sclerosis, and my father ended up taking care of my mother, as well as having a full-time job. He, took care of my mom who, since I can remember as a child, had multiple sclerosis. And, which is a disease that attacks the nervous system and basically causes all of them to short out, and also cause plaque to form on your brain. So, my mother had a lot of, mental issues as well. And we don't know at this, it's so hard to know, like, if she had also this huge confluence of health issues. But anyway, so coming back to care, so thinking again about the sort of reliance of the disabled on the temporarily abled, and then, that sort of like what sort of relationships are born out of that. Thinking again a lot about my father. So, coming up to here, open the door. Door opens. So now what's going to happen with the plant is there are a number of areas that, when you move to, they will actually, so the timer isn't necessarily working yet, but you'll see the leaves start to turn black and they actually start to wilt. And what you're going to be doing is needing to find water. So a potted plant just becomes a really good sort of like, I don't know, allegory or metaphor, hopefully something else too, for sort of reliance, because there's this thing that exists. And because we've sort of contained it in this way, it is, by necessity, it requires care of another. So anyway, I'm going to move through here and a couple things should start happening. See, the leaves are turning black and they start wilting down. So right now they'll just stay wilted down like this and they won't shake very much anymore. But eventually what'll happen is after they wilt for enough time, you will actually, pass away and be unable to revive yourself.
At first, I don't think she started immediately because the medication wasn't as good, and they didn't really understand it. Plus, our insurance did not cover it at all. And to be honest, we didn't. It was very expensive, so she didn't start it immediately. So, that was probably a mistake looking back at it. I don't know if that would have changed the course of her disease or not, but hard to say. She had such an aggressive form of it.
So I've been doing interviews with my father, and there's certain spots that when you enter in, they'll randomly select one of, I think it's like 20 different clips. I don't have it yet set that if it runs one clip, it won't run it again. So I need to still figure out that sort of code of like pulling something out of an array when it's, once it's played once. But anyway, so I've been doing these interviews with my father talking about care in like, I'm really, interested in the weight that really put on him. And it's something I've always appreciated and sympathized and, loved about him is like that care that he was able to give, but also like sort of how voiceless he felt through that. They had children, 4 children, full-time job, and then this very sick partner. So anyway, so I'm going to continue to move around the world. So you'll see now the leaves aren't really shaking. Now, I just started putting these in, but I'm going to start putting in more pixel art. I've been teaching pixel art at a university, and, there's going to be more to these. These are just sort of placeholders. It's again comes back to my stupid obsession with sort of tentacles and such. But anyway, so the idea now is that you're going to be searching for water or sustenance, and there'll be some text that'll help you do that. So the way you do that, there's a couple ways you can find it now is if you like jump up here and come to the faucet and get right under it. Let me see if I can get and hit the F key. The water will start going. I have to change that collider so you can actually get into the stream. But you'll see it brings the leaves back to life. and you're revived. Hallelujah. And there's our little pixel art things. Another spot that you can revive yourself will be in this bathroom. If you can't at the sink, but if you open up the toilet, you can revive yourself in the toilet water. All right, so we're going to continue moving on. So I should hit another spot that's going to darken my leaves again. Again, this is like I just really started working on all this, so it has a lot of work to do.
No, she had the most aggressive form of VMS of the
same
three.
clips.
Hers was more chronic and slow. Hers was very aggressive. So I remember when it was getting towards the end, it wasn't within days, but it was, like maybe 6 months before Mom passed away. Grandma told me once, she says, I just hope she goes quickly. And I wasn't thinking about that, I'm not thinking about that. I'm just thinking about, I'm going to get her better. I'm going to take her to the hospital. We're going to do whatever we got to do, and she's going to keep going, and that was the first time I really thought about it, that, that I'm going to lose her.
So eventually, again, I'm still figuring out what the collection you'll collect.
She was unconscious, and I drove under the emergency room sign. She opened her eyes up, and she saw the emergency room sign, and she screamed, "No, not the emergency room!" And then she just went back out. So at first, they would not sedate her. They were heavy enough to knock her out. I said, after a while, I realized you have got to knock her out, because she's not sleeping for 3 or 4 days. She just loses her mind. I said, you have to knock her out. I have to give her Ativan and give her enough to knock her out. And they wouldn't do it at first. And she would go through these horrendous things where she would pretend that one of the first times she was at she was at Oakwood, Maine. And she would start digging at her stomach and saying that, I'm pregnant with the devil's spawn. And, she would start tearing at herself. So I had to go to the nurse's station, and they won't restrain people unless it's really, really bad. I said, she's going to hurt herself.
So I still need to change it so that the same spot only ever triggers once. But so eventually, once you've collected enough things and solved the sort of puzzles, you'll be able to open this elevator, and that'll sort of transport you to a different space. But I'm going to stop playing this real quick. And so because we got so delayed, I'm just going to show very quickly a different scene, which is the sort of child, just want to show the controls of the child. All right, 1 second. Like I said, I'll just show this for 1 minute, and then we'll start my conversation with Alex. Oh. All right, well, thank you so much for being here, Revolution or Death. I'm not it's a cool name. So this is sort of entering in the child world. And you'll see that, oh, it's Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. I'm so glad you're here. So, like, as you sort of move through the child, you're sort of in this sort of like, again, this is like a more like sort of sci-fi-ish liminal space, and sort of, it's also sort of like flickering back and forth between, different things. And again, I won't go too deep into this, but I sort of just wanted to show the control of this character. Then as, there's these guardrails that are around that actually serve the opposite function. If you interact with one of them, you'll end up sort of falling down, and you have to try to, hit the F key to bring yourself up. And so this is where if anybody who hadn't seen any of the other streams, I really, the other streams are on this Twitch and on Fulcrum's site. And it really goes, this is a lot more developed than the sort of plant world. But you know, for time's sake, we'll sort of leave it, you know, be. You can see it's sort of like, you know, navigating. But all right, so I'm going to stop this real quick. And then I'm going to start this because I had to restart this. I'm going to start our my start my Zoom chat with Alex and Geneva, and stop there. All right, you'll be seeing a little too much. Zoom meetings, everyone's familiar with that. So I'm going to, so for Alex and Geneva, I am going to just we can just use our previous meeting. I'm going to start that. So if you want to sign in on that, we can get started. Says I have another meeting in progress. That is dumb. This is that same meeting. Let me stop again. Best laid plans, everyone. Best laid plans. All right, 1 minute. Sorry for all of the technical difficulties. This is our 8:30 p.m. Let me click start again to try it. It's giving me a different screen this time, so let's admit there's Fulcrum Arts. Hello, and here comes Alex. Geneva, can you try talking for a second?
Sure. Hi.
Great. I'm getting input from that, so that should be working. Great. I'm getting input from that, so that should be working.
Weird feedback loops.
Weird feedback loops. I don't know if the two of you, just to make sure, yeah, you have Twitch muted.
Right.
Yes.
Great, great, great.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Phil, you handled that with such grace and aplomb. The internet is just not as reliable as we thought we would be at in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, let me just reorganize this a little bit. You know, that is the problem with the internet. It's terrible.
It's not reliable. Just like the,
Is that the only problem?
No. Oh my God, no. There's so many problems with the internet. I could spend the rest of my life talking about that.
Yeah.
The internet is a fallible body.
It's almost like toxicity didn't really exist before the internet, or we didn't really know what toxicity could be.
Oh, come on. Yeah.
We thought, yeah, exactly. We thought it was just like, not, no stick pans or something like that, but it's like so many other things.
Much more. Well, hey, I just wanted to show up here for a second to say hello, say thank you, introduce myself, introduce Fulcrum to people who aren't familiar, and to introduce you too before you have a little chat. Phil, it's been really great having you in this like virtual residence or long form publication. We're still trying to figure out the terminology for the forms of sequencing publications, but regardless to say, it's been really wonderful having you perform these iterations of Ghosts and Flowers as it's in development over the past month. I think it's exciting to see someone make a game about someone's lived experience in the moment and be able to share that with people. For those who are not familiar with Fulcrum, I'm Geneva Skeen. I'm the program coordinator for Fulcrum and the main curator for sequencing. Fulcrum Arts is an organization based out of Pasadena, California. Our mission is to champion creative and critical thinkers at the intersection of art and science to provoke positive social change and contribute to a more vibrant and inclusive community. I presume most of you are a little bit familiar because you found your way here via Phil and this project. And sequencing itself is a new project of ours, and it's partially born out of, Fulcrum Arts' migratory and influx programming practices. We do all kinds of different residencies and partnerships with people in the community, but it's also this online space is partially born out of the pandemic, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. But in general, sequencing is very new. Phil is our second published publication, but it's designed to be an ongoing and really engaging space for artists who are presenting work specifically to live in an online space, not just some rendering of a gallery and a photograph of your work or a video of the work that's being presented in an online rendering of a gallery. We're really trying to build a space that's discursive for the artists who are publishing there and whose work can talk to each other's work. Technically, we are an online transmedia publishing platform, providing space for critical conversations and expressions at the convergence of art, science, and social change. And Phil has been here for the past month with this really wonderful essay and these variations of the live stream. And next week, we'll have some really interesting 3D renderings and an essay by Phillip Birch. And we'll have Colleen Hargaden, who's a sort of DIY disaster aesthetics video artist and sculptor and rocket scientry teacher. We'll have Raven Check on later in 2021. So I'm really excited about the kinds of really different works that we've got coming on sequencing. Phil, you are an artist. You live in New York. You work in New York for now. I'm just going to read a little bit from your bio. Phil's work utilizes animation, sculpture, and video games. It focuses on technology and history, and Birch's work traces a possible trajectory of human development, calling into question the linearity of progress. His work and research explores topics such as disability theory, autoimmune disease, body horror, Catholicism, schizophrenia, and game theory. And we're extra lucky to have Alejandro Segade with us tonight to talk with Phil about this work. Alejandro Segade is an interdisciplinary artist whose projects span video, performance, writing, drawing, and comics, using genre to question contemporary and historical constructions of group identities. Alex collaborates in art collectives, makes exhibitions and installations, directs movies, and performs live. There's a lot to say about Segade's work.
It's okay,
He's done really great things with My Barbarian and a number of other collectives, but that's what the internet is for. People can Google stuff, and you guys can talk about
it. I even have a website now because of the quarantine.
Yeah. Oh yeah, quarantine project.
I got a few websites now. Yeah.
Great. Well, you have a few projects, so that seems to make sense. Anyway, I'm going to disappear from my face screen and let you two talk, but really excited to have you both here, and thank you both so much for participating.
Thank you, Geneva.
Thank you so much. Hey.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Phil. How are you? Thank you for that walkthrough of the game. How are you doing?
I'm doing, all right, as well as anybody, I guess. Good days, bad days.
Sure.
But, doing all right. Excited to be, have something to work on.
Right.
So, that's something.
Yeah. Yeah. Congratulations on this. So just for I don't know, to kind of be clear on where you are with the project. So this is still in development. So this is pre-alpha. What do you mean by that?
So there's it's sort of that's sort of like a video game term. There's different levels of game, so alpha is where things are still really rough. You're still very much figuring out mechanics. You're doing some play testing with it, but it's only play testing with very closed, groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so pre-alpha even means like it's like not even like this hasn't even been built out of the the game engine I'm building this in is called Unity, and it's one of the two, there's two sort of like middleware-ish platforms that are both pretty popular now. There's Unity and Unreal Engine. I'm doing this in Unity, and so it hasn't even, it's still like sitting in the game. It's like not its own application yet. It's still running within that, that thing that's being used to build it. And partly I did that for the stream in case, I had some crashes, and then, if it crashes in the engine, I can just boot it, start it up again really easily. So the next step will be, which I'm hoping to get to by the end of January, will be sort of like beta, where I'll be putting it on, at first, itch.io, like itch.io, which is a platform for indie game developers, really great site. And sometimes terrible site, like, there's a range of content on there, I'll say. But for, playtesting and such, and like sort of more, open, and that when it'll be, considered beta. When will it be done? I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about this sort of like idea of software and the patch and how things can be continually patched. So maybe it never comes out of beta. There's sort of opportunity there, which I sort of think is interesting.
So almost like it's a kind of performance that gets revised and added to, or, rather than ever be a finished work.
Yeah, there's something about the static that I'm becoming more and more, I don't know, maybe because I've been in the same like apartment for too long, but there's something about the static that's like really sort of, I don't know. Like I've been thinking so much about like even sort of like artwork and the finished artwork, and I don't know. There's like flux is far more interesting, at least right now, far more interesting to me.
Well, there's a couple ways then we could go with the conversation. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about when watching it was watching your performance, which I thought was really interesting because you were commenting on the game as it was playing, and then giving us kind of a sense of the the reasons for particular choices, the references, and so it was kind of like the director's cut or something like that, kind of walkthrough / director's cut. But I guess I was wondering about like thinking through this question of sort of like existence and existentialist theater almost, where you have like something like no exit as the kind of model, right? Where it's a bunch of characters in a room, they don't know why they're there, and they don't know really what the room is. And then what ensues is a kind of treatise on sort of the question of being, among other things, right? And I'm wondering if like that resonates with you, sort of thinking through a kind of theatrical, because another thing I was thinking about was the fourth wall, and how the way we see it is through this perspective where we're looking in one direction, but then you actually reverse it, and then we just have blankness at that point, right? It's just a kind of white blankness. So I'm wondering if you're kind of thinking about, I don't know, making characters to talk to while in isolation, or if these characters are sort of like representations of particular positions you have within your own kind of self, as it were.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They are it's sort of a mix of that. It is like in part it's sort of, like the lungs are definitely sort of like, they're not just lungs, they have eyes, and they have like sort of like a mouth sort of formed from the body of I'm terrible at anatomy, but whatever, like part of the, like trachea, esophagus, that's right up there, like that sort of, so, I was looking, as I was sort of like drawing it out, I was like, well, that kind of looks like a mouth, and then I was like, well, maybe it could have eyes. Anyway, sort of thinking through that, so that they do become these sort of like, sort of allegorical points of reference, but then they're also sort of these like generated beings. And I'm trying to get to some sort of like, I don't know, I've thought a lot about, it's actually something that you said to me a few years ago, that we were talking about character design, and you said this comment that is like really resonated and stuck with me, that there's a lot of traps in character design. And so it's something, I've really thought through a lot. And so like with these characters, I've been trying to get to some sort of like, distilled essence or something like that, and sort of abandon a lot, the child isn't wearing clothes. The only real like sort of like flourishes are like the lungs with eyes, but it's still like a body part. So it's not, while it is ridiculous for it to have these stalk eyes, they still are sort of, there's still some sort of like connection there. There's the toilet, there's a plant. Later on, there's this sort of like, potentially, if you go a different route, you can play as this almost like angel character, and so there's that character. So yeah, but I do think about them sort of like generated out of isolation and loneliness, and also a lot of ennui, a lot of ennui, like especially, sort of like I started working on this at the beginning of quarantine, alone, and felt really lucky that I had like a space to be in, and that I wasn't immediately jettisoned out into the world. But I also was like, felt very, contained. And then it sort of developed into this, I don't know if it's almost like Stockholm syndrome, where I started like, really loving this isolation, but then that sort of became this feedback of sort of, I don't know, cathartic, negative cathartic. I don't know, where I was like, I don't know, there was some sort of loop there that happened that was really, that felt like it was becoming toxic in a way. And so a lot of this game me starting to work on it really comes out of that, of like sort of, pushing that some sort of form of, I don't know if cathexis is the word, but some sort of like, like use of that ennui energy and that sort of like tension that I was feeling all the time. So the characters are a mix of both, subject positions that I hold, but then also subject positions that I sort of like hate about myself, or I feel like an antagonistic relationship with, but then also sort of projections and conversations I want to have. Like I've named all the plants in my house now, and they've never been healthier than they are right now. And like that started really, coming again, thinking about care and reliance. So anyway.
Well, there's so many things that we could talk about here. I mean, one is, of course, the sort of differences in the way that different spheres of culture think about things like representation, figuration, the kind of fact that in video games, for the most part, representation of the body is not an optional thing. It's going to be there somewhere or another. And it's interesting to me that you have, made so many characters that are not a human body, either not a full human body, or they're an object, they're plant. So, I mean, that's one kind of thing I'm kind of interested in, is like this sort of confluence of different types of ways of looking that you have given us in this one game. So from the flat art, that's on the kind of graph paper to the fully rendered three-dimensional animated form. And I guess I'm kind of wondering how you think about like modulating those kinds of modes of representation, and when you use one, when you use another, and then the kind of question of like different audiences looking at it and maybe getting different things out of different aspects of that.
Yeah, I mean, so
does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. But if I start going off, the question, like, just like steer me back, or like, but yeah. So as far as like these sort of like directly these two different, modes of, represent the sort of flat, illustrated versus the 3D model, there's like it's something I've always sort of struggled with. I've been like modeling and animating for a very long time. I've done it professionally a bit. I've done it, I've taught at university level, like those subjects for a long time now, and 5 or 6 years, but I've also used it in my own artwork for even longer. So it's something I feel very comfortable with, but I feel like I see my hand so much in it. But there's this sort of sense of the 3D rendered as like not being, like there isn't that it's the computer that generated this thing, which I always find so interesting, because like at least I'm not using any sort of like artificial intelligence. I'm also not downloading models from other things. Like that sort of craft is so. But to me, those are, but like to sort of help to, create that sort of connection, like, like I'll usually when and this is sort of like more mechanics than anything, but I think maybe it gets to it, like I'll make all these drawings that I'll base my models off of. And so like, so that I bring those into my 3D modeling software and use those as reference, that when I'm remapping that cube, I have it drawn from the left and the right and the top and sort of reshaping that. So I thought it was really interesting to bring it into this. And there's a trope within a lot of visual novels, and it sort of comes from Japanese role-playing games, where you'll be in this 3D space, and then on the sort of like, laid over the interface of the screen is usually a illustrated or even like done in like computer illustrated like version of them, but not CGI. So there's that sort of relationship that happens. So I'm trying to enact with that trope, but instead of taking the really well, like the really well finished drawing, they're sort of really rough and sketchy, and I'm leaving in the graph paper, and I'm leaving in sketch lines, and even embellishing that a little bit, like for sort of emotive purposes. But I feel like there's like some sort of connection to that, and some sort of like, again, I'm interested in like sort of like, just like with the like where my voice will come up randomly, like you might have a playthrough of the visual novel where you don't hear me at all. It runs a random number generator, or it might run of one of like many clips that I'm taking purposely from these live streams, so that they're not super well considered. They're not, written out there. It's performative, but it's a, sort of a performative meta insertion into it, which, I know in like, the meta is so it's so in fine art spheres, it's such like a well-worn track, but within game design, I think there's real opportunity there, and something interesting about, again, it's sort of exposing that labor and making, my voice another layer, but also like specifically vulnerable within this thing. I don't know if that actually answered your question or not, but those are some of my
No, I
thoughts.
mean, it gets me to thinking about this. I mean, I guess this is something that, would be the question. And it's interesting, I think a space like Fulcrum Arts offers a certain kind of maybe potentially even bringing together, a broadening of kind of an audience, but it does frame the work as art, right? Whereas out in the world, once it's out of this particular like beta or pre-alpha or whatever mode we're in, like what it might end up doing is sort of my question. Like, what are you thinking is happening here? Are we inserting or introducing kind of strategies from like conceptual art making, for example, into the sphere of the video game? Is it happening the other way around? Is it a loop? How do you see this kind of like in terms of its circulation of audiences? What are your goals for it?
Yeah, I mean, audience is something I've definitely thought a lot about, and I'm not, at least right now, I'm not so I mean, I'm interested in how some of the strategies of art can be used outside of art, because I think there are some really interesting, complex, nuanced strategies. As far as platforms go, I'm not so interested in those spaces as those spaces exist in the world as these sort of, physical locations in which you enter in and you experience, a series of static or even interactive or whatever objects. And because, thinking, as we're all, really forced to start, I mean, not that we shouldn't have been considering this for a very long time, but, the recent confrontations of colonialism and white supremacy. And, I've been thinking so much about, sort of the art world and sort of like at least the West, which has become so much of a dog whistle for, those words, right? Like the West is like colonialism and white supremacy in so many ways. And our like greatest achievement, right, is in some ways is like fine art. And even though it's such a small part of economy, it's something that everything is always trying to locate itself next to, right? There's like cinema's highest aspiration, right, is to be considered art. Video games are always trying to position themselves as an artwork. And I'm not necessarily trying, I don't know, like this is a very loose, I'm trying to figure out ways to unentangle that. And I want this to sort of exist just like, without necessarily, that's why, it'll exist on like itch.io, and then eventually probably, hopefully on like, GOG and on Steam and these other platforms where, it'll be and I think it is important not to treat there's not like these monolith audience. Like there's not the fine art audience and the theater audience and the video game audiences. There's overlaps and bubbles, and there's like specificity within all of those. But I'm particularly interested in is, sort of the indie game. In the indie game sphere, I think there's a number of really amazing things happens. I've always been continually impressed by organizations like in New York, like Baby Castles, which sort of operates as this sort of incubator for experimental games, or even thinking of things like the NYU Game Lab and that being open to the public, not right now, but, they would always host Thursdays where you could go and like, bring the game you're working on, whether that's a video game or a tabletop, role-playing game or a board game, and actually play test that with like, and meet, people. So there's like these sort of networks of communities that I'm particularly interested in engaging with. And I'm really interested in the sort of disabled game, within, because obviously even indie game world isn't a monolith as well, and there's a million different things. So I'm particularly interested in, sort of disability within gaming and accessibility, and like I'm planning on, one of the things is like adding as many accessibility options as I can into this, while at the same time really interested in the sort of like notions of someone being able to, like, a temporarily abled person temporarily abled person playing the game, and degrees of empathy and understanding that can sort of be, what happens when, games so often enact with this sort of like power fantasies, or you play a body that you gain ability over time. You gain, you become more powerful through your weaponry or upgrades or whatever that is, where I just keep thinking about how life sort of works, like we are temporarily able, that we're all sort of moving towards disability, and that, there's going to be a third character you can play as where, sort of you do start off as this sort of powerful thing that gets, sort of stripped down as you pull through it. So again, like speaking, sort of, I guess I do think it's problematic to look at video games as empathy machines, because I feel like it's buying into some sort of marketing about them that I'm a little bit skeptical of. And it's something that Audrey Annabelle talks about in her book, Playing with Feelings, Video Games, and Affect Theory, which has been a really big influence on me. Anyway, like there's potentials of, I think a lot of it, there's a game called Kentucky Route Zero, which is really fantastic and episodic. And like, so I feel like it sort of opens up certain discursive conversations that normal media might not be like a film might not be capable of. I think about it, Walter Benjamin, talked about sort of like each new media sort of like absorbs and encapsulates every single media that, preceded it. And so video games really are that, right? There's like everything. There's like film, there's cinematography, there's music, there's theater, there's all these things sort of wrapped up in it. So I don't know. I think there's
comics. I mean, it struck me that was sort of the structure in a way, the picture and the word, right?
Right.
And it'll be interesting to hear when it is acted out, or when you have an option to listen to the voiceover. But I guess I want to ask you more about this in terms of disability. So how does that manifest for you as a designer in the game? What are the choices you have to make to think through this relationship we have between, pressing a button and the reaction that the body, that the avatar has? What do you do as a designer to kind of put pressure on that relationship and make us think about disability while playing?
That's a really good question. And that's something I've been, that's part of the core of what I've been struggling with, because one thing I've really been, I feel like there's this line between, empathy and triggering. And like, I really am trying to figure that out. So as like a designer, I've been sort of working to sort of like frustrate and short circuit my own, inclinations toward making things work. Like what happens when you make things not work? What happens when you make the controls not responsive? What happens, I think a lot about, multiple sclerosis. I'll just keep saying MS because it's such a weird word to say. MS, where literally that sort of connection where like what you want to do and what the body does is getting sort of disrupted and short circuited. So with the controls of that child figure, a lot of that is sort of getting acted out so that like it'll randomly fall at times. There's an area that you enter in where there's all these like sort of like Roombas with googly eyes, and there's a whole room of them and they're sort of chasing after you and like in cleaning, and you're sort of navigating and you have to complete these tasks, and if they knock you down you have to sort of start the whole thing over again. So it's like frustrating, and I'm trying to like and again, it's getting towards the viewer or the player. It's not just a viewer, it's the player to sort of understanding a body that doesn't always operate, like, because video games are like, that's also the core mechanic when you're designing a video game is making the player feel like they're in control, right? That, things are responsive. So I was really interested the question of what happens when they're not responsive, what happens when they don't work the way that you want it to, what happens if they like so much of games are also like, there's this really horrible mantra with games that I like despise called, get good. And it's simple, but the idea is like hard games shouldn't have an easy mode because you should just have to learn the sort of, learn the mechanics that, there shouldn't be sort of accessibility options. There shouldn't be these things because you should just get good. And by learning the sort of the rules and the structure, which sort of really does unfortunately mirror how much of the real world works, right? And so what happens when you make a game that someone can't get good at? Because like the second you start to learn the system itself changes or like inverts itself.
I mean, do you worry with that about making it too hard so that the player loses patience? I'm curious about that because I think there's something really interesting about like a game that's frustrating, and also making a game where the avatar isn't a kind of wish fulfillment, but rather maybe something else entirely. Like, being a plant, I maybe have fantasized about that before, but a plant that wanders around an office, that's a kind of totally different image than, say, becoming like a flying gladiator or whatever, as the usual kind of video game promise. So I guess I'm asking a couple things, like the kind of will to play something other than, a kind of fantasy character, and then, how to make it playable enough, or if that's even a concern, really, to keep going.
It is a concern, and I think that only will come through, and I don't think it's there right now because it's so much of me playing it, and I think that's only going to come out in the sort of like beta testing of it when like I'm getting lots of other feedback and like and because I am trying to like skate that line. There's like games like that I'm referencing in that, who even though I don't think he's specifically talking about disability, there's a designer named Bennett Foddy who's I think currently at NYU, who is really amazing designer, who games always somehow circulate around mobility, but also deep frustration. His most famous game is QWOP, just QWOP, which was just a browser game where you play a runner and you have to try to move the different legs using, Q, W, O, and P on the keyboard. And it's very, very hard. But but at the same time, that does have a system. If you learn the system, you can become good at it. And so that's something I'm interested in disrupting. But that's also, I think, a really interesting, or his follow-up game to that which is called Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, where you play, the whole game is made from asset flips, meaning he just downloaded stuff from like the internet, but then you play as this sort of like bulky guy who's in a cauldron with a hammer, and you are trying to climb this mountain, and it's very hard, and you will often, when you fall, say you get to the end of the game, and I think if you really know how to play it, you can beat it in 15 minutes, but most people will never get there. If you fall, there's a good chance you're going to fall all the way back down to the bottom. And I always thought that was really like an interest. And meanwhile, he is speaking over it, talking like, you can do it. Don't give up. Don't get mad. And there's something really infuriating and frustrating about hearing them. You just want to, like, slap them across the face and be like, but anyway, so, but that is like, it's definitely a line. But I do, I do want frustration to be there. But like, again, I think only through like extensive testing will I find that sort of, that sort of space where it's like, and I think maybe it will be too frustrating for some people. And I also am really, I do want to, like, part of it is how frustrating it will be sort of gets developed by the choices you make, in the visual novel. And so there are choices that, sort of I'm interested in. And also another mechanic that's, I have that, we haven't really seen is every time I played, it loads a slightly different version of the script. So choices can, I'm really interested in the idea, the sort of the randomness that, it's potentially, happening there. And that, because of that, there's slightly different choices that, so, you might, and there's like, again, randomly, my voice comes up at different parts. And then when you're in the world, randomly, my father's voice will come up in different parts. And so again, like no playthrough will ever be the same. And I think there's some, again, I'm not sure exactly why, but there's something in that sort of random generation, or procedural generation that I think is sort of interesting. But
I'm wondering if you think about this idea of care and as part of the way that a player plays a character. Like, is that something that is part of the kind of discussion around sort of affective? I'm not a video game player. I play like D&D on Roll20 with a group of people, and I read comics. That's my like proximity. And a lot of my favorite characters in comics end up as characters in video games. And I think of the kind of power ranking that ends up becoming a part of that is actually a sort of toxic effect on the comic book medium. Actually, like it kind of loops back, and then it's less about like the plot or the sort of like idea of overcoming an obstacle, and it's more like, well, no, actually you're ranked here, so Nightcrawler can never beat Apocalypse or whatever, that kind of thinking. So I'm wondering like how you're kind of resisting that, and how a player can maybe think about, rather than the character that they're playing as a kind of weapon, but rather as something else. And what is the other thing they become is sort of a question I might have for you about, and thinking about like this character that you play that falls down. What is the mechanism there as a player? Is it care? Is that an example then of how we care?
Yeah, I mean, so that was why I made like an early on decision not to make this first person perspective, but to have it in the third person. And part of that is like, because, first person perspective, does become this, very interesting embodiment, where you are playing as but because of that, it allows you just to project yourself into the space, right? And, and then it becomes sort of immersive. But I want the sort of, you control the character, but at the same time, it is this sort of other outside of yourself that, you're sort of constantly forced to, negotiate with. And then as far as weapon goes, so that's something I'm trying to think of it, less at like, so purposely there's no like combat ever in it. There's no there's no health bar, there's no, at least, there's no like you fall, like you might have to retry, but there's no ever like, sort of, I don't know, it was something I really struggled with, the idea of a fail state. And I didn't want that, because I do think that it's sort of like, I think a lot about, Mackenzie Work's, her really wonderful book, Gamer Theory, and this sort of like gamification of space, and this sort of like how it almost becomes like the sort of like Plato's allegory of the cave, where it's sort of this projection of game space, game space, game space, game space, game space. And to where, I often think about in relationship to like Fassbender's World on a Wire, where it's like the sort of like the Simulacron 5 that we're all sort of like in or not. So anyway, like sort of an aside, but thinking about, that. So yeah, I'm not sure. There is, I mean, I do think there's sort of within the, like, because it is very comic booky, right? And that's like a big part of why, I did, when Fulcrum was like, hey, who do you want to do this with? I was like, oh, I'd really love Alex, because you had just come out with the, your comic, The Context. And I feel like, thinking through some of the same things of the like embodiment within character design as forms of embodiment, and sort of thinking about that. So you're playing as this character, as this sort of like, hopefully through the visual novel, what that draws sort of is like a connection to what the embodiment of what this character might be. And so that when this character falls, there's more, you have even more empathy for it. Because so you see, like, you've read that the child just really wants to dance, but obviously they're stumbling and falling through this world. And I am going to create more of a connection between, right now it's like a little bit too separated, those two worlds. And like, I am going to introduce more sort of dialogue and like sort of like, things, interactions that sort of weld those two, were like, it's something I'm sort of working on now, is welding those two spaces together a little bit more, so that sort of connection, that sort of like, you've like, yeah, like as if you said like that Nightcrawler can never beat Apocalypse. So like that, but it's funny because it actually, I think it does actually the sort of opposite, where it like, in something always frustrating to me, because as someone who loves comic books so much, but like I am always so frustrated when I play the video games, because if you're playing as Colossus, you generally have as many hit points as like Nightcrawler or something like that. I'm like, no, that shouldn't be how this works. Like we should, like Colossus should be able to be, taken down by that guy's ray gun or whatever it is. So there's this sort of like, homogenizing their powers, because you don't want to make anybody's power, too powerful, or, and you obviously never can play as like Professor X in a video game, because like, one, how would that manifest? That would actually be a really cool video game. Someone should really work that out. But anyway, I'm not sure if that totally answers the question. Like,
well, I mean, I know that you're interested in affect theory, and I'm kind of wondering how it's manifesting in your thinking about the game, and that relationship between player and character.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I don't know. I think it gives, the ability to role play. I mean, I think it's as simple as that, but it's role playing something, again, it comes back to, not to circle back, but it's role playing, the non-power fantasy, or the non, dreamt about body, but maybe not a real body, but like more so yeah, I'm not, that's something I'm sort of really sort of teasing out and figuring out, is this sort of, coming back to this idea of like thinking about sort of affect theory, sort of like, sort of like versus Brian Masumi, who's so like steeped in like Deleuzian thought, thinking about someone more like, Eve Sedgwick, who is like actively thinking about the body, not, we're not, that's sort of like, we're not machines, that you can't reduce us down to this, sort of like, I don't know, like mechanical essence, and that there's some sort of connection between that and like essence in video games that I'm not sort of entirely sure about, that I'm still really teasing out, trying to figure out.
That's super interesting. I mean, it kind of, to me, there's a kind of reversal of the kind of logic of the movie Avatar, where you have, the kind of wish fulfillment that happens through both like a kind of colonial fantasy and also like a more able body that you can access through some kind of CG,
Right.
But that which kind of leads me to this other question that I had for you about this interest you have in critiquing, self-critique, around questions of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and then how that kind of keeps sort of re-emerging in the form of like Lovecraft references, or like what the connection might be to that. I'm interested in that specifically, but also more broadly, how you're thinking about this like game. On the one hand, I think as a kind of almost like there's an element of biography here, like a kind of allegorical biography, or at least reflection on your life and your experiences, and then sometimes very moving direct documentation of that, and then also kind of self-critique. Like that seems to be, both of them seem to be happening at the same time. You're telling us in a fairly coded way, but through the performance of what you did tonight, a very explicit way about how the game is connected directly to your own experience. And then you're critical of that. And so I'm interested in kind of like that process for you, and then how Lovecraft keeps popping up in that process.
Right. Yeah, Lovecraft, right. So I feel like, and so with like speaking specifically about Lovecraft, Lovecraft is one of those things that like I wholeheartedly just love. And it like I can't, like learning all the things that like maybe that like fish people is actually just allegorical for Jewish people, or whatever that is, like it doesn't stop. And that part of me wants to, sort of rooting out white supremacy, thinks that like I should be excavating these things, right? But I'm not going to. So and maybe it's even more problematic bringing them in. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about as I guess the whole art world has been thinking about, like Philip Gusted and those like sort of paintings of, those self-portraitures of the, self as the KKK, which like sort of like, thinking about again about like how, artwork, you can implicate yourself in your own artwork. As a sort of aside with white supremacy, one of the things too, like that I found so frustrating for myself, and sorry to upset anybody, but like I've been just like moved between like smirking and so angry at like what I felt like is white art's like upsetting at the like taking the show and deferring it for a year. It's not even canceling the show. And I've like, whether that's like a good idea or bad idea, I don't really know. But like I've just never seen like the white art world more up in arms about anything ever. And it's like, oh, you don't care about these institutions who aren't or like who will only hire Black curators as like for these interim positions. You don't care about like, Warren Candors at the, the Whitney. You only see that as a slight, like annoying obstacle to it. So like, again, it's anyway, sorry, long aside. So, but thinking about that, thinking about ways to sort of like implicate myself. And by doing these streams and recording myself, that will come up sometime, me saying that will come up in playthroughs. And so that it will be coded, but then sometimes it'll be explicit, and hopefully there's being some sort of connection between that. But then also there's something about, I thought a lot about like Lovecraft as sort of the first alt-righty troll, which is also a group that I'm interested in penetrating with this game. Like I would love like this to be taken up by, people in, sort of like more conservative gaming spheres as like, oh, there's this really hard, frustrating game you have to play. And like that maybe there's potentials for entering into space there, and that there's conversations that could happen. Again, I'm not thinking that it's going to be this sort of like gotcha moment or that I'm going to convert anybody. But again, like entering into those spaces, because there is that, whether I like it or not, there is this very toxic world of part of the video game community. And how do we like not, I mean, it's God, I don't even want to say build bridges with them, because so like, but how do we like possibly create a dialogue? I'm not sure, or maybe that's impossible, I don't know. But it also feels like part of my job as a white person is to speak to those communities, because it's certainly not any like Black person's job to speak to those communities like that. Like labor is that's white labor. That's the labor we have to be we all need to be speaking to our families, speaking to friends, speaking to online to different communities. And so so those are ways that I'm thinking of interacting. So like by, recognizing that my own role within it, and the role, same sort of like, when there's that the world made for you. And I'm still working on that dialogue and thinking about layers of specificity that need to happen with it. But you know, when like something happens in the world and I don't get the thing that I applied for that I want, and the frustration in that, and like having to pull myself back out of it and be like, well, why do you expect to get that thing? And like, you know, like what is this about yourself that you thought like, oh yeah, of course I'll like that will happen for you, and these expectations and such. So I don't know.
Because we've been, yeah, sort of taught to think that the secret is the only way to succeed. You know, like, I mean, that there's this like envisioning something is the way to get it, and that actually is a function of privilege. So, you know, yeah, exactly. I mean, so it's interesting to me to think about a game where, you know, you're kind of thrust into a situation that's so defamiliarized as a player, and then even the controls themselves or like the goal of a particular moment may be as simple as getting up off the floor. It seems to me that that's a really, I don't know, that has really interesting implications when you start to think about that in terms of privilege, you know? Where, I mean, most games seem to be like a way of sort of enacting like a fantastical, not most games, but a lot of games I've seen, a way of sort of enacting a kind of fantastical version of privilege, you know, like, but I guess with Lovecraft, I mean, I was curious, did you watch Lovecraft Country by any chance?
So I watched the first 2 episodes, and I've been so busy between this and that, so I have to like continue. I watched the first 2 episodes. The first one I was intrigued by. The second one, I don't know, it started to fall into this almost like Lost, J.J. Abrams-ish sort of mystery box thing that I was like became like started like becoming, you know, where you just sort of layer the mystery on top of mystery with this idea that it's like this, you know, that you actually never get to the thing, and that even if you ever would, like with Lost, you would ever get to the thing, it's so deeply disappointing. But so no, I need to, you know, over this.
I don't know if you do.
Yeah.
I don't know if you do. I would actually recommend N.K. Jemison's The City We Became as a much more interesting conversation about Lovecraft, much more direct actually, and more of a contemporary. Did you read that book by chance?
I have it. I ordered it. I ordered it. I have it off of, it was either your or Sandra's or somebody's recommendation, and then I just, again, it's like I can't wait till like all of my classes end in a week, and it's like I'm just going to spend so much time reading, so I'm super excited. I have been in some of my spare, you know, N.K. Jemisin Twitch streams every once in a while, so I've been, you know, watching some of those, which has been really fantastic. But
she's amazing, and that book is really fantastic. But I think in terms of, because my fear with the Lovecraft material has always been that it is so toxic that it makes it, like, I think it's incredibly seductive. I've read all the short stories. I haven't read the letters like you have, but I'm pretty familiar with it, and it similarly caught me at a weird moment where I was a nerdy English major type person as a elementary school kid, you know what I mean? Like, so I was always like into big words, and so like it's totally attractive when you find this, like, you know, incredibly deeply nerdy fiction that appeals to all of the kind of childhood kind of fears and fantasies all at the same time, and then continually being confronted with its racism, but not being sure how to contextualize that. And particularly in the time when we grew up, there wasn't a huge conversation about what to do with that kind of experience, but it wasn't unique to Lovecraft. And there was so much that you would encounter that was coming from a pretty explicitly racist place that would be taught in your, you know, English class as if it were normal, you know, so it wasn't like it's all on Lovecraft, right? But as time's gone on, I've been wondering, because of its presence within the internet and in other kind of circles, like how Cthulhu became a symbol for a kind of nihilistic white supremacy. And even in Donna Haraway's writing, the way that she has to kind of disavow Cthulhu even as she's embracing the Cthulhu scene, you know.
Right.
It's very complicated. So I thought when I watched Lovecraft Country that maybe it is in fact too toxic to do anything with. That because what my problem with that show is that I think it doesn't replace enough of the narrative structures that maintain this violence. And in fact, all it does is really just sort of subvert who is in what protagonist position, but it doesn't really actually take apart the structure that maintains the violence. And whereas the Jemison book, on the other hand, completely dismantles the narrative logic of the kind of racist fantasy, and is, you know, much more contemporary as a result. But that's us. That is an aside too, and it is kind of getting late. So I want to let you go, but I want to commend you on this. And you know, when we're talking about character design, I mean, I think it's so interesting to think about a kind of minimalism in character design that you're working with, because we talked about that idea of there's being kind of traps in character design. And it's interesting if you look at deviant art right now, thanks to, you know, the way that people are drawing now, which is mostly on, you know, an iPad or some kind of layering, like Photoshop technique, the costumes have gotten incredibly elaborate. Like character design is all about like how many hairstyles you can fit on one head. They all have face tattoos. Everybody's got like asymmetrical shoulder, you know, decorations. And these are like these really minimal, fantastically like pithy and kind of almost like, with the exception of the child who makes expressions, there's a kind of almost like disidentification that's just built into the way that you're designing your characters. So I think it's really interesting to think about a kind of minimal character design here. And then one of the things when we're talking about this idea of embodiment that this allows you to do is actually kind of split the body into, you know, constituent parts, multiplicities, and also even non-bodies as bodies, you know, the plant and the toilet and, you know, these other forms. So I think it's super interesting. I'm excited to actually play it as a player and see what it feels like.
Yeah, I'm excited to have, you know, everyone I know start playing it too. You know, I feel like it's almost there, you know, just a little, maybe another month or two of work,
Yeah.
and it'll be there. And then there'll be the complications of getting it to play on a Mac, because Apple sucks and they've made it very difficult for developers. But that's an aside. But yeah, so, and also one real quick, yeah. So just wanted to say in response to the Lovecraft thing, it's something I'm it's something I'm still actively struggling with, and I don't know. There's like, I feel like I'm trying to like insert, and maybe like the sort of like pixel tentacles is actually bringing too much of it in. I feel like those sort of like books with the eyes have other potentials and reference also horror movies and some other things too that don't necessarily have to be Lovecraftian. But yeah, I don't know. It's just still something I'm very much figuring out. And I do think it is, yeah, that well is maybe too tainted. But
I don't know. No, this is just something that I worried about, but not in the case of you, but in the case of maybe me and the whole and like looking at, you know, people's attempts to kind of subvert things simply by replacing, you know, one person with another person's body. It's not actually, it doesn't fix problems.
right.
But I think that there are ways to change the way we interact with narrative, change the way that, you know, even like challenge this notion of a protagonist, a hero. All of those things I think are part of the problem, and that gets me back to like something maybe more like Ursula Le Guin's, you know, carrier bag theory of fiction, which I think this video game maybe starts to get us to in the context of video games, is a kind of container in which all of these different ideas can exist, and not thinking about it as a kind of like linear narrative where it's just leveling up all the time, you know. So I think that's amazing, actually, and I'm really excited about that.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah,
I also want to tell everybody that I'm in an Airbnb in Fresno, and that is why this room is where I am, because I feel like I'm in the room that you designed, kind of. And behind me is like, do you see that art thing?
Yeah.
That's actually just like a frame with like plastic flower petals, like pasted in that scattered form, but it's mostly just like a blank frame that's just big and in a room. That's me. So
Amazing.
I'm judging your
Love it.
choice in Airbnb. So
it's actually a cute Airbnb, but I'm in
it
Fresno.
looks cute.
You know, I don't know what to tell you. Anyways,
Hey,
all right.
Alex, thank you so much for
Thank
joining us.
you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much for doing this with me, Alex. It's been really
Thank
awesome,
you.
and I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
It's a pleasure having this conversation with you, and congratulations.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. And thank you,
Thank you,
Fulcrum
Phil.
and Geneva, for inviting this. This has been really awesome. So,
It's been really
all right, everyone.
awesome having you.
And
Thanks, Phil.
thank you for everyone who came and listened to us
Nice to
talk.
see everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.